Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for September 11th, 2020. And as you're probably already aware, today is the 19th anniversary of that horrible event years ago. And on this episode, I want to share with you what I see as the top three leading ways government has grown and made things worse since then. We're talking surveillance, war, and spending and debt. I've got some interesting articles from FEE, the Rutherford Institute, and StartPage.com. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can get everything you need to follow this show over on our show homepage, which is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty, all spelled out. On each individual episode, I include links and references, which are published anywhere from a half hour to an hour after the live broadcast is done. So definitely check that out. But you're going to also find all the different platforms we're on, all the previous episodes, and even ways you can support us, like our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month. And trust me, we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this done in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Again, surveillance, war, and debt. And let's start out with surveillance. Here from the Department of Defense from 2016, they're quoting the former NSA director, or he was NSA director at the time, Michael Rogers. Let me pull this up on the screen for those of you watching. And this is pretty profound. It's an honest statement from the NSA. The 9/11 attacks drove fundamental change in the way the U.S. government uses and shares intelligence. No doubt about it. Most of that fundamental change has been away from the Constitution, has been away from the Fourth Amendment. It has been closer to what part of what the revolution was about against the king and parliament, the Empire of Great Britain, the idea of general warrants rather than a warrant based on probable cause, for example. Now, looking over at StartPage.com, they've got an interesting post in the last week about security versus privacy and how things have gone pretty crazy since that time. And they put it this way. Before 9/11, the government could only demand information about people for whom the FBI had evidence that they were an agent of a foreign power. Following the attacks, George W. Bush signed the Patriot Act and allowed the government to demand information about anyone, regardless of evidence or warrant. Warrant requirement, worthless. We're scared. We need protection from government. The USA Patriot Act, they write, also increased the government's power to spy in 4 areas: record searches, secret searches, intelligence searches, and trap and trace searches. And of course, on October 26th, 2001, that was the date that Bush signed that Patriot Act. And a lot of times when we talk about surveillance after 9/11, we think of the Patriot Act, but a lot of what happens in the public sphere, the debate over it, whether it should be sunset, whether they should extend it, or it should be modified, is really only about a small sliver. It's Section 215 primarily, the Call Detail Records program. Should it go to court? But that most of the Patriot Act was actually permanent from day one. And I covered that in an episode last November, the Patriot Act on steroids, surveillance state beyond Section 215. And it's important for us to know that most of it is permanent. And not only is it just the Patriot Act that we have to be concerned with, there is follow-up legislation that came out of that same issue there. The Department of Homeland Security Act of 2002, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. What did those things give us? Combined, those three gave us things like fusion centers, the information sharing environment. Basically, if you're in a small town in Idaho and they have a license plate reader and they're collecting information, that data goes through fusion centers or ISE, and it's shared with the entire national intelligence community and all local law enforcement that participate in this around the country. Basically everything and everywhere. We got the TSA expanded screening process. We got the Real ID Act of 2005. We also got requirements that DHS implement biometrics at airports, like facial recognition surveillance. So surveillance has been a huge part of this. I encourage you to check out that full episode that I did last year if you haven't yet, and it'll give you all the details about those permanent programs that came out of 9/11 and go beyond the small pieces of the Patriot Act that are generally debated in public today. So let's talk about war now. Hear from Brad Palumbo just a couple of days ago over at FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. He says, when President Bush launched the war on terror in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, few, maybe the late great Harry Brown might have, few could have predicted the campaign would entail U.S. involvement in combat in 24 countries. 24 countries in combat in 19 years and continuing. But it did. And he links to those 24 countries. You can click and read about it. And the resulting conflicts have come at enormous costs we are only now beginning to fully realize. Brad goes further. He says, from the Iraq War to the 19-year and counting military intervention in Afghanistan, 19 years, and it's still going. The U.S. has spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of American lives in protracted military engagements. But there are other people, too, who have suffered incredibly. We know that, he writes, across all sides, an astounding 800,000 civilians and combatants have died in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen since the U.S. got involved. 800,000. This is a tragedy that I can hardly even speak to be honest with you. He does cite a new report from Brown University's Cost of War Project, which you might be familiar with from this show last year. He says they find that the war on terror has also led to the displacement of at least 37 million people. I've linked to the full PDF here. It's a pretty interesting report, 30 pages. You can read through it. There's a summary. They go through their methodology and you can get all the details. But that is a massive amount. And even if it's overstated or understated, we're talking 30 million, 10 million, 50 million, whatever the exact number is, it's huge. And again, it's a tragedy. They also did a report last year that I covered briefly, at least on this program, November 13, 2029, and they're talking about spending. They say since late 2001, the U.S. has appropriated and is obligated to spend an estimated $6.4 trillion through fiscal year 2020 in budgetary costs related to and caused by post-9/11 war. $6.4 trillion. An estimated 5.4 of that in appropriations in current dollars, and an additional minimum of $1 trillion for U.S. obligations to care for the veterans of these wars through the next several decades. Insane amount of spending. They have to steal the money from you in the first place. They don't have it. They never cut anything. They're always telling us they need more for infrastructure, military, or whatever, anything in between. And it's just, again, they're ripping us off. And they're stealing our treasure to continue this militarism. And remember, of course, James Madison warned us. He warned us. He told us that war is the greatest threat to the public liberty. And in his words, not mine, he said, war is the parent of armies, and from armies leads to debts and taxes. He says, armies and debts and taxes, James Madison said, are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And that brings me to number 3, debt and the scope of government. And here we go to John Whitehead over at the Rutherford Institute, which we often publish over at TAC. This was from September 1st of this year. He says, given the rate at which the government has been devising new ways to spend our money and establish itself as the solution to all our worldly problems, the current crisis will most likely end up ushering in the largest expansion of government power since the 9/11 attacks. And it's very likely we're looking at the largest budget deficit in history. Without a doubt, for this year, this fiscal year, no question, the record's already been broken. In fact, it's actually double what the previous two guys did as their record. So it's insane what's going on. John goes further. He says, this expansion of government power is also increasing our federal debt in unprecedented leaps and bounds. Yet the government isn't just borrowing outrageous amounts of money to keep the country afloat, it's also doing so with indecent sums to pay for programs it can't afford. It can't really afford any of these. He says, without fail, every president in the last 50 years has expanded the debt. but it is going nuts. And in fact, economists he talks about, they warned us if the national debt ever got larger than the total size of the U.S. economy, we were guaranteed an economic collapse. Now, an economic collapse is not a positive thing, but we have to be aware that it is very possible at this point because that amount, those numbers, the national debt just got larger than the entire economy in June of this year. And no one is talking about cutting back spending. More militarism, largest military budgets in history, even though the U.S. already spends more on military than the next 8 to 11, 8 on the conservative end, 11 in the most recent stats that I've seen, countries combined, all those great enemies of the U.S. out there, those big spending, dangerous countries combined, you're talking about 10, 11 of them combined spend about what the U.S. does. They don't need to spend anymore. And John says it this way. He says, at some point, something's got to give. And he is absolutely correct. When I read this, it reminded me of a great speech that I went and saw in person here in Southern California in Whittier from the late, great Chalmers Johnson, who wrote the Blowback trilogy. I encourage you to read those books if you have not, or maybe we should all revisit them at some point. And this is how he put it. He was talking about the U.S. borrowing like $2 billion a day from China to basically service the debt. However that all plays out. I don't really know a lot of economic stuff, but he's basically saying, look, this is nuts. It can't continue. And in fact, things that can't go on forever don't. And we know that this kind of spending, this kind of surveillance, this kind of militarism can't go on forever. And before we head out here, I want to quick point out my episode that I did on 9/11 last year that I think is worth checking out one more time. 9/11, fear is the foundation of most governments. And of course, you may recognize that quote as coming from John Adams in 1776. Of course, I always point out that it's not most, it's all governments. Fear is the foundation. And fear has led to more surveillance, more spending, and more war. Looking to the largest government, largest military empire in history to protect us is absolutely nuts. Now, James Madison warned us about that, and I pointed this out in the summary of that episode. He says, perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. I will link to that and all these other articles in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I hope you found this information. I hope you found this informational. I hope it was educational. I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. If you support what we're doing, you like this show, you like the TAC, you like this channel, whatever it may be, please do a few things to help us spread the word. Smash the like button, leave a review on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're on, sharing links, commenting, all that stuff tells the platform's algorithm to show the program to more people. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset as well, you can also support us financially through our membership program. Please do not feel obligated to do so, but if you got a couple of bucks a month, it starts out as $2. We make it cheap and easy. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. When a lot of people pitch in together, it allows us the financial backing to do what we need to do to continue reaching new people. Again, I hope you're having a good day. I hope you've got a good weekend up ahead. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.